Hey, Walter Sorrells back with more tips for the knife maker. Today, for my Pop's project of the month, I'll be forging an integral chef's knife. I seem to be on a little bit of a chef's knife kick right now, so why not keep up the momentum on my Pop's project of the month? Now, integrals have been around for centuries, of course, but they've gotten really popular lately with custom makers, and for good reason. Now, if you're not familiar with them, the basic idea of integrals is that the bolster, the blade, the tang, the whole schmear is all forged from one piece of steel, making them ultra durable and pretty sweet looking too. I'll be starting with a Pops exclusive here, a piece of 1-inch silver steel round bar that Pops has brought in on an exclusive basis from Sheffield, England, cradle of the modern cutlery business. More about that later. I'll start by putting a point on the round bar. Now, if you're familiar with the fish mouth problem, which is common when forging from rectangular bar, it's about 10 times worse with round bar. If you just try to whale a point into it, you'll end up with this little belly button on the end, and that is no good. But there is a solution. I'll just forge it right down to a point, shearing that little future cold shut belly button thing right off on the edge of the anvil, leaving a perfect point. Now, I'm going to be doing most of the forging today by hand just to show that it can be done. I'm using 1-inch or 25mm round bar because that'll leave plenty of material for a really king-size chef's knife. You can easily get a 2-inch wide knife out of this. But I will not lie, silver steel forges a little hard, plus this is a pretty sizable piece of stock, so you'll really have to go after it to get an integral out of this by hand. So, what I'm doing now is pre-forging the tapers here, first by forging a tapered point, and then by flattening it out. Before I form the flats though, just for reference, I'll use a guillotine hardy tool to neck down the point where the tang will be formed. This is not necessary at this point, but is really just to show me where I'm aiming. Today's video is, of course, sponsored by Pops Knife Supplies. Pops has everything you need for knife making, steel for both stock removal guys and hammer bangers, a huge supply of handle materials including all kinds of woods, bone, horn, antler, tons of cool micarta including Pops specialty, vintage micarta, all sorts of abrasives, including every kind of belt you can think of, sandpaper, specialty abrasives, fasteners, tools, you name it. Now, Pops has some really cool news. They'll be moving to a newer, much larger facility in a few months. Of course, they got a great retail space right now, but if you live in Georgia or someplace in the area, I mean, this new place is going to be a real destination. Just tons of retail space, huge amount of inventory, so keep your ears open for news on that front. popsknife.supplies. If you're curious about what silver steel is, it doesn't have anything to do with the metal silver. It's kind of the trade name for an English tool steel. It's sort of like O1 steel in the US in that it's the old standby of tool room steels in England. It's pretty different in composition though. It's got about 1% carbon, fairly low manganese, a pinch of chromium, and a little bit of vanadium, which gives it pretty high hardness potential. It's sort of vaguely comparable to 80 CRV2. Now, this is a new steel for me, so I'm really interested to see how it works out. Now, time for the flats. You can just blast away if you want, but it works better to cant your hammer a little and drive as much material as you can toward the cutting edge. Apparently, I'm driving my new anvil stand all over the place too. Gonna have to get that firmed up a little. You might think from looking at this that I'm forging the cutting edge up where it's sort of bellying out from the stock, but actually I'm going in the other direction because even though it doesn't look like it, there's actually more material moving in that direction. Once that's done, just flatten, flatten, flatten. With stock this size, this is just brute force, just whaling away. Now, the blade needs to be centered in the bolster, so it's very important never to let the bolster onto the face of the anvil. If you do, you'll drive the blade over to one side and have a hard time getting the blade back to center. Also, you want to work both sides equally. You'll notice I've radiused a section of the edge of my anvil. This helps me drive the cutting edge down cleanly without getting cold shuts or cracks in the interior corner. Next, I'll forge in the bevels. When I forge bevels into Japanese blades, which many of you will know is sort of my specialty, I normally work in sections of about 4 inches at a time. Here, though, I forge all the bevels at once. Why? I just feel like it. Now the bevels are in, and this is starting to look like a knife. I like to do a little bit of what I call editing at this point, just making sure things are centered and even, that nothing's too far out of whack. Now look, I'm not aiming for perfection here, because the next operation is going to throw everything out of whack, but the closer I can get now, the less monkeying around I have to do at the end. Now I'll jump over to the guillotine again and really set off the neck where the bolster meets the tang. Once I've necked it down a little bit, I'll use the cutoff tool to chop the knife off of the bar. I always try to avoid tongs and do as much forging as I can while I'm holding onto the bar. You just have a lot more stability that way. Believe it or not, there's plenty of steel in this tiny little nub to forge a substantial tang with. I've been forging blades for decades, and every time I chop something off this short, there's a little voice inside my brain that says, "That's not enough steel, bro." But, of course, it is. See? In fact, I'll actually end up cutting a little of this off later on. Now some more editing to make sure everything is straight, flat, centered, and so on. The better job I do here, the less problems later on. The most important thing to make sure you get right is that the blade and the tang are all on a dead straight line. It's easy if you don't pay attention for these to be kind of offset, and that can really create problems. Finally, 3 rounds of normalization to refine the grain and relieve some of the forging stresses. Next, over to the grinder. I forged this thing a little thicker than I normally would because there's really just plenty of material in that 1-inch bar, so the grinding took a while. There's a temptation to leave the spine really thick on integrals, but I can tell you from years in the kitchen and testing my own blades for decades that when it comes to kitchen knives, thinner is better. Doesn't look so macho, but it cuts better. This one still came out on the thicker end of blades that I make, but it's still in the range that I like. So here's where we come out. Then the fun part of the integral, filing the shoulder. I'll slip the blade into a filing guide, then blast away. This took me a good solid hour. The important thing here is you want it absolutely dead flat all the way around so that everything's on the same plane. Anything else will look super bad, leaving a big ugly glue line where the tang meets the handle. Now it's into the heat treating oven. Pop's recipe is a 10-minute soak at 1520 degrees, then quench in a fast oil like Park's 50. This is theoretically a water quenching steel, so you really don't want to quench it in just any old random bucket of transmission fluid or lizard snot or whatever. After that, 2 rounds of tempering at 390 degrees Fahrenheit. So in the thumbnail and the intro to this video, I showed this really cool cloudy looking phenomenon on the blade. The reason it happens is right here in the heat treat. If you hang into the end, I'll give you a full explanation of why. After tempering, I'll head back to the grinder and clean everything up. For the handle, I'll be using this spectacular dyed and stabilized wood supplied to me by Pops. I'm not big on really dramatic dyeing, wild colors and all that stuff, but this has just enough of some sort of caramel colored dye to bring out the figure in the wood. I'll cut it down a little to get it closer to the handle shape. I'll drill out a channel first, and then using this nifty brooch supplied by Pops, I'll open up the channel. If you want to make this kind of handle, man, you gotta have one of these. I've used a lot of tools for this particular job, and this is the best thing I've ever used. It really makes quick work of opening up that channel. Next, glue up. I'm using a slow cure Bob Smith epoxy from Pops. It's getting harder and harder to find slow cure epoxies, at least in smaller retail type quantities, so this is really handy to have. Once it's cured, I'll trim it up. Then head back to the grinder. Grinding a handle with interior curves like this can be a little tricky, so you want to go nice and slow. Then eventually you're going to want to use a slack belt fixture with very flexible belts to get inside those curves. As I've said ad nauseum over the years, you really want to try lots of different kinds of belts and see what works for you. But I can tell you this, anytime you're inside, you always want flexible belts like J-weights and stuff like that. Last but not least, every knife maker's favorite, hand sanding. So, as I mentioned earlier and showed in the thumbnail to this video, this blade came out with this wild cloudy look. For many of you, this will be pretty familiar. It's a hamon. In the Japanese sword world, you get them by claying up the blade and going through this process that produces them in a fairly controlled way. Now, the reason for this, without getting too deep into the metallurgy, is that when blades are cooled from what's known as austenitic condition, which is generally north of 1500 Fahrenheit or so, to a much cooler temperature, they'll change their molecular structure to what's known as martensite, which is the hard form of steel that you need for cutting tools. Now, here's the tricky part. Every steel is different. So what temperature you have to heat them up to, what temperature you have to cool them down to, how fast you have to soak them at particular temperatures, how fast that cooling happens, all this stuff plays into how that hardening process works. Now, in this case, silver steel if it doesn't cool very quickly from around 1500-ish to around 300 or 400-ish, it just won't harden. So in this particular blade, the thicker part of the blade retains enough heat, even when it's quenched in a fast quench oil like Parks 50, that it doesn't cool down fast enough to make the martensite conversion. And so you can actually see the transition zone between the fully hard and the fully soft parts of the blade. So that's what really makes this blade look so cool. So if you're going to use silver steel, this means that if you make a small thin knife, you'll have no trouble getting it fully hard, but if you make a much larger, thicker knife, you may well end up with a hamon like this. So what if you don't want a hamon? Well, there's always water hardening. Why the funny face? Well, I won't get into that here, but the general point here is that if you like hamons and you want to experiment with something that has the potential to give you some really wild and interesting results, silver steel might be the steel for you. It's a reasonably complex alloy, and the more complex the alloy, the more tinkering around you may need to do to get exactly what you want out of it. But I really see a lot of potential here in this steel. Thanks for watching, guys. If you like what we're doing here, please subscribe and make sure that you click on that bell so you get notified of all the latest videos. Want to buy a knife from me? Check out my modern blades at tacticsarmory.com. Digging the channel? You can support our video making efforts on Patreon. You know, I've been banging away on these videos for like 10 years, so I hope you'll show some love for all that hard work. Link in the cards and descriptions. Finally, if you're interested in making Japanese swords, check out my full line of Japanese sword videos where I show how to forge Japanese swords as well as how to polish them and how to make fittings, handles, and scabbards. WalterSorrellsBlades.com.